You wake up one morning and something feels different. Not in the dramatic way movies show it. No thunderstorm, no message from the universe. Just a quiet, subtle unease. A heaviness that has no clear origin. You sit in bed, phone in hand, scrolling, replying, checking, until a moment of pause. You realize how automatic it's all become. How every notification pulls you. Every message expects an answer. Every silence from others feels like rejection. And every small part of you has been stretched thin, one reaction at a time. You get up, and the day moves you more than you move through it. Conversations blur together. People ask, "Are you okay?" And you smile the way they expect you to. You say, "I'm fine," because it's easier than explaining what even you can't quite articulate. But deep down, something is shifting. Not out of anger, not out of apathy. Just exhaustion. You've been too available for too long. And now a strange thought emerges, like a quiet whisper at the back of your mind. What if I just stopped? Stopped replying right away. Stopped explaining. Stopped justifying. Stopped trying so hard to be understood. What would happen? Would everything fall apart? Or would something deeper finally begin to rebuild? You've been trained your whole life to be accessible, to answer every call, respond to every emotion, meet every need, even when it means abandoning yourself. And somewhere along the way, availability became survival. You equated presence with love, accessibility with worth. But here's the paradox. The more available you are, the less people value your presence. The easier you are to reach, the easier you are to ignore. You've probably felt it. That quiet resentment that builds when you keep showing up for people who don't notice. That aching frustration after giving your all, only to be forgotten. That dull emptiness that follows after performing politeness for so long, you no longer remember what silence feels like. Here's the cruel irony. You were never taught how to hold yourself back. But you were punished the moment you tried. You learned that silence is seen as cold, that not replying is rude, that choosing yourself is selfish. So you smiled when you were tired, said yes when you meant no, explained when you owed no one anything. And with each compromise, you handed over little pieces of yourself, hoping someone would notice, hoping someone would return the favor. But they never did. Not really. Not in the way you needed. Why? Because the world rewards performance. It praises availability, but it forgets to tell you that both are prisons. And the moment you even think about stepping out of those cages, everything trembles. People get irritated when you don't respond. They call you distant, difficult, strange. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because they can no longer control the version of you they were used to. This is where the power shift begins. Not with shouting, not with revenge, not even with confrontation, but with the sacred act of withdrawing, of becoming a mystery in a world that feeds on exposure, of choosing absence in a culture that demands attention, of becoming so grounded in your own stillness that others begin to question the chaos they've grown comfortable in. But here's the question you're not supposed to ask. What if not being available makes you more powerful? What if every time you didn't respond, you were reclaiming a piece of your energy? What if every silence was not a punishment, but a mirror? And what if the real reason some people are uncomfortable with your unavailability is because it forces them to sit with themselves for the first time? Think about it. Who gets irritated when you take longer to reply? Who tries harder to provoke you when you remain calm? Who accuses you of changing when you finally protect your peace? These reactions are not about you. They're about your absence, revealing what they refuse to face in themselves. So the real question isn't, what happens when I become unavailable? It's this: what happens to the world you've built when you stop being the one holding it up? The moment you pull your energy back, the illusion shatters, and standing in its place is something you haven't felt in a long time. Sovereignty, stillness, power. But before you can fully reclaim it, you must understand what made you give it away in the first place. Not just emotionally, but psychologically, historically, philosophically. And that's where we go next, because this story didn't start with you, but it can end with you. You weren't born reactive. That was taught. From the moment you could speak, the world began molding you. Smile when spoken to. Respond when called. Apologize even when you're confused. Stay polite even when you're hurting. The lesson was simple. Your worth is tied to your accessibility. And slowly, like water dripping on stone, your inner boundaries eroded. You learned that love must be earned by availability. That silence means failure. That saying no is selfish. That discomfort in others is your responsibility to fix. But beneath these rules was something more dangerous. A system designed to keep you externally controlled and internally disconnected. Carl Jung called it the persona, the mask we develop to survive in society. It starts innocently. You become the peacemaker, the fixer, the one who's always there, always replying, always bending. And people love that mask. They reward it. So you keep wearing it, until one day, you look in the mirror and no longer recognize who's looking back. Because behind the mask, there's a self that hasn't breathed in years, a self that doesn't want to be available, a self that's exhausted from being used as an emotional vending machine. You think you're being kind, helpful, generous? But Jung warned us, every act of self-abandonment, even in the name of love, is a quiet betrayal of the soul. This is the hidden problem. It's not just that you're available to others, it's that you've become unavailable to yourself. And in that imbalance, you become vulnerable. Friedrich Nietzsche once said, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." But what happens when your why becomes centered on other people's comfort? When your reason for being is how useful you are to someone else? That's not compassion. That's collapse. And the collapse is silent. It happens in the way your heart sinks when your phone lights up, in the way you rehearse your responses to avoid conflict, in the way you say yes but feel like screaming no, in the way your peace is constantly postponed in service of being liked. Here's what no one told you. Every time you react without reflection, you're not acting from truth. You're acting from programming. And that programming was designed for survival, not sovereignty. Psychologically, this shows up as people-pleasing, guilt-based empathy, and codependent dynamics. You're conditioned to believe that your discomfort is safer than someone else's disapproval. But approval is a moving target. And those who require your constant emotional presence don't love you. They feed off of you. Jung warned of this danger when he explored psychic energy. In his view, the human psyche isn't an infinite engine. It's a system, a battery, and every emotion, every thought, every reaction costs energy. So the question becomes, where is your energy going? Because if you're constantly explaining, defending, proving, chasing, replying, your psychic energy isn't being invested, it's being bled out. That's why you're tired. Not because you're weak, but because you're misdirected. You've become a power plant with no grid control. Anyone can plug in, drain you, and walk away. And the more accessible you are, the less respected you become, because what's always available is rarely valued. This is where Schopenhauer's bleak brilliance cuts through. We forfeit 3/4 of ourselves in order to be like other people. It's true, isn't it? You silence your boundaries to avoid being too much. You hide your sadness to seem stable. You diminish your needs to appear easygoing. And every time you do, a part of you fades. Not because anyone forced you, but because the fear of being unloved made self-erasure feel safer than self-expression. But what if the very thing you're afraid of, being misunderstood, rejected, abandoned, is the key to becoming who you truly are? Jung called this path individuation, the process of becoming whole, not by gaining more, but by stripping away everything that isn't authentically you. And here's the terrifying truth. Most people will never walk that path, because it requires stepping away from the emotional crumbs society has trained you to chase. The likes, the replies, the praise, the comfort, the illusion of connection. To become whole, you must first become separate. This is the psychological rebellion most never attempt, the act of stepping away from the collective, not in bitterness, but in sovereignty. It begins when you stop playing your part in a story that's killing you, when you stop smiling through pain, stop responding on demand, stop trying to be chosen, and choose yourself. But that's not the end. That's just the awakening. Because the moment you become unavailable to the world is the moment the world starts trying to access you again. And that is where the real test begins. Are you ready? Because in the next part, we'll explore the unseen consequences of living in emotional captivity, and why your silence, your absence, your calm changes everything. It starts small, a missed message, a longer pause before replying, a quiet refusal to explain yourself. You assume no one will notice, but they do. The people who once relied on your constant presence to comfort, to validate, to reflect their worth, begin to feel uneasy. Not because you've attacked them, but because you've removed something they were feeding on, your emotional availability. And suddenly you realize something terrifying. You weren't being loved. You were being used as a mirror, as a sponge, as a buffer for other people's emotional noise. This is the first consequence of becoming unavailable. Your absence reveals truths that presence always concealed. Your silence becomes suspicious. Your peace becomes threatening. Your calm becomes a confrontation. Because when you stop playing your role in someone else's emotional ecosystem, they're forced to confront the void you used to fill. And many don't like what they see in that space. Carl Jung warned of this in his writings on projection. When someone can't face their own shame, they project it onto you. When they can't accept their own fear, they provoke it in others. And the more accessible you are, the more you engage, respond, explain. The easier it is for them to use you as a dumping ground for their unconscious pain. But when you stop reacting, the projection collapses. And in that collapse, people panic. Not because you've hurt them, but because they've lost their favorite emotional outlet. This is the energetic backlash of reclaiming your boundaries. You stop being a source of comfort and become a mirror of discomfort. You'll hear it in their words. You've changed. You're acting distant. You used to be so easy to talk to. But look deeper. What they're really saying is, I can't manipulate you anymore. I don't know how to control this new version of you. I'm uncomfortable now that you've stopped bleeding yourself for my peace. And here's where it gets even darker. When you were endlessly available, the world applauded your kindness. But now that you've chosen yourself, the applause turns into accusation. Because your presence was never appreciated, it was expected. Your kindness wasn't valued. It was exploited. And your energy wasn't respected. It was consumed. Silently, consistently, without permission. But when you withdraw that energy, even slightly, people feel betrayed. Not because they loved you, but because they lost access. And in a world addicted to access, where your value is measured by your responsiveness, your withdrawal becomes an act of rebellion. This is where cognitive dissonance kicks in. They know they didn't treat you well. They know they took advantage. But now that you're not reacting, they feel wronged. So they rewrite the story. You're selfish. You're cold. You're arrogant. They build narratives to justify their discomfort, because admitting the truth would require confronting their own patterns. But here's what makes this consequence so dangerous. You might start believing them. You'll question your own silence. You'll wonder if you're being cruel. You'll feel guilt for simply protecting your peace, because your nervous system has been trained for reaction, trained for urgency, trained for rescue. The dopamine hit of being needed, the temporary relief of being understood, the illusion that staying connected means staying whole. But this is the trap. The more you give, the more they expect. The more you explain, the more they question. The more you try to be enough, the more they feel entitled to all of you. And slowly, invisibly, you disappear. This is what Viktor Frankl called the loss of existential agency, when your life becomes a response to the world rather than a creation from within. You're not living anymore, you're reacting, not choosing, but compensating. And the cost? Your identity becomes a reflection of your surroundings. Your value becomes defined by others' approval. Your soul becomes diluted in 1,000 unspoken compromises, until one day someone asks you, "How are you?" And you realize you don't know how to answer, because you've been living for everyone else's narrative and you've forgotten your own. But here's the paradox. The moment you stop, the moment you step back, say no, breathe before reacting, everything begins to shift. Not just in your relationships, but in your body. Your heart slows, your mind clears, your soul exhales, and for the first time, you feel presence, not as a performance, but as a quiet, immovable truth. But this is also the moment when the world pushes back the hardest, because the system relies on your participation. Your silence disrupts the dance. Your absence reorders the equation. And those who once drained you, gently, subtly, even lovingly, will try to pull you back, with guilt, with drama, with carefully disguised concern. Don't fall for it, because the truth is, and Jung knew this well, you was never meant to be available to everyone. Not emotionally, not spiritually, not energetically. You were meant to be whole within yourself and selective about what reaches you. So when the discomfort comes, don't retreat. When the guilt whispers, don't reply. When the invitations to over-explain arrive, stay still. Because what comes next is power. In the next part, you'll discover how to reclaim that power, not through force, but through the quiet, sovereign act of refusing to abandon yourself ever again. At first, you thought the rebellion would be loud. You imagined it would come with burning bridges, dramatic exits, or powerful speeches that left everyone stunned and silent. But the real rebellion, it's quieter than you ever imagined. It's in the pause before you respond, the breath you take before defending yourself, the decision to let the phone ring because your peace matters more than their crisis. It's in the moment you say, "Not today," and actually mean it. Because breaking free isn't about being aggressive. It's about being unavailable to what once controlled you. The patterns, the projections, the pressure to prove your worth. Carl Jung called this individuation. The process of becoming whole, not by adding more, but by shedding what was never really you. And this is where everything begins to shift. You start noticing the way your body tenses when certain people enter the room. You become aware of the subtle contracts you've signed with others, unspoken agreements that say, "I'll always be there for you, even when it costs me everything." You feel the pull to react, to defend, to explain, and then you don't. You breathe, you observe, you stay still. And just like that, the cycle starts to dissolve. This is strategic withdrawal, and it's one of the most radical acts of emotional self-respect you'll ever commit to. Because the world will not applaud you for doing it. In fact, it might punish you. People will accuse you of being cold, arrogant, selfish. But what they're really saying is, you're no longer easy to control. And that's the point. You're not here to be easy to understand. You're here to be real, to be whole, to be free. So how do you break free? Start by identifying your emotional hooks, those reflexive responses that pull you back into someone else's drama. Maybe it's the guilt that rises when you say no. Maybe it's the panic that floods your chest when someone's disappointed in you. Maybe it's the shame that whispers, "You're a bad person if you don't help." None of these feelings are truth. They're programming, emotional conditioning, passed down from generations too wounded to set boundaries of their own. This is where you rebel. Not against the people, but against the pattern. Against the story that says your worth is found in how useful, agreeable, or accessible you are. That story dies the moment you stop reacting, because when you stop reacting, you start reclaiming your energy, your attention, your direction. You begin choosing when and how to engage, not from fear, but from intention. And this shift doesn't make you less loving. It makes you more powerful. Think about it. What would happen if you moved through your day deliberately, not compulsively? What would change if your silence wasn't avoidance, but mastery? What if your absence wasn't punishment, but a boundary? Suddenly your energy stops leaking. You begin to feel solid, grounded, present. This is where your presence becomes magnetic. Not because you're performing, but because you're finally anchored. People feel the shift before you ever speak it. You stop chasing, you stop explaining, you stop bending, and the world, confused by this new version of you, starts to recalibrate. Some people leave. Let them. Their departure is not a loss, it's a rebalancing. They were never truly connected to you, only to your availability. Now your absence reveals the truth. Others will try to provoke you. Stay still. They need your reaction to validate their reality. And your silence denies them that oxygen. And some, a rare few, will lean in closer. Not out of need, but out of respect. Because they see something different in you now. A stillness, a strength, a clarity. You're no longer emotionally on call. You've become unreachable. Not because you've closed your heart, but because you've stopped leaving it wide open for anyone to take. That is sovereignty. But this rebellion doesn't end in detachment. It ends in discernment. You don't have to disappear from the world. You just stop giving the world access to parts of you it never earned. You don't have to shout, block, or banish people. You just stop explaining yourself to those who never tried to understand you in the first place. You don't have to harden. You just stop leaking. Your time, your attention, your emotional oxygen. And from this place, something sacred happens. You begin to build a life that doesn't depend on being chosen, needed, or validated. You begin to choose yourself, not in theory, but in practice. You become rare, unforgettable. Not because you're trying to be, but because you're no longer trying at all. The rebellion is complete, not when others accept your boundaries, but when you no longer feel compelled to explain them. And from that moment forward, every silence becomes power. Every breath becomes clarity. Every choice becomes a reflection of someone who is no longer performing for belonging, but creating from wholeness. That's what waits on the other side of the rebellion. And in the final part, we'll go even deeper into the most profound realization of all. The truth you were never taught, but always felt deep down. That freedom isn't something you find, it's something you remember. There comes a moment, after the silence, after the withdrawal, after the storm has passed, when something unexpected arrives. Not applause, not validation, not even clarity, but stillness. And in that stillness, you begin to hear something you hadn't noticed before. Yourself. Not the version shaped by obligation or expectation. Not the self that danced for acceptance or played small to keep the peace, but the self that's been waiting, quietly, patiently, beneath all the noise. The self that remembers. And what it remembers is this: you were never meant to be accessible to everyone. You were never meant to be understood by everyone. You were never meant to sacrifice your soul in exchange for approval. You were meant to be sovereign, to move like the moon, distant, luminous, untouchable, to walk through the world unbothered, not because you don't feel, but because you finally know what deserves to touch you. This is the final, most powerful truth. The more you try to be everything to everyone, the more you disappear from yourself. And this disappearance, it's slow. It doesn't happen with a scream. It happens with 1,000 quiet yeses, 1,000 swallowed feelings, 1,000 reactions given to people who never earned the right to hold them. And one day, you wake up, empty. Not because you're broken, but because you've spent everything you are on everyone else. But here's the miracle. The moment you stop, the moment you breathe, the moment you say no without guilt and yes without fear, your soul begins to return to you, piece by piece, memory by memory. You remember what peace felt like before the world told you to prove yourself. You remember what it felt like to be alone and not feel lonely. You remember that your worth was never meant to be negotiated in the first place. And from this remembrance, you rise. Not louder, not more polished, but real, still, untouchable. And here's what they don't tell you. When you embody this kind of inner calm, this kind of rooted presence, people feel it before you say a word. Your boundaries don't need defending. They become invisible gates no one dares to cross. Your silence doesn't demand explanation. It becomes a mirror, and people either see themselves more clearly or they turn away. Your energy no longer leaks through the cracks of people-pleasing. It becomes a fire you carry, not to burn, but to warm only those who've earned a seat beside it. This is the power they never taught you, because a world addicted to control and chaos fears the calm. It fears the person who doesn't need to shout to be heard, the one who can walk away without slamming the door, the one who doesn't respond, not out of spite, but because the conversation was never worthy of their presence to begin with. And that is now you. But here's the most poetic twist of all. You don't need to become someone new to reach this. You only need to stop being what you never were. You were never here to explain yourself to those who chose not to understand. You were never here to carry others' wounds while abandoning your own. You were never here to prove your softness by tolerating disrespect. You were always here to remember your power, to protect your peace like it's sacred, to honor your time like it's gold, to defend your energy like it's a kingdom, because it is. And now, you are its sovereign, not the ruler of others, but the master of yourself. You walk differently now, not because the world changed, but because you did. You no longer fear being misunderstood, because you no longer fear being alone. You no longer explain your silence, because you know it speaks louder than any defense ever could. You no longer react, because peace is no longer something you chase. It's something you've become. And this transformation, it's not dramatic, it's deliberate, it's not loud, it's legendary. So when people ask, what happened to you? You smile, not to explain, but because they already feel the answer. You changed not by becoming someone else, but by finally becoming someone they can't reach without rising to. This is the final truth. Silence isn't absence, it's dominion. Presence isn't performance, it's power, and your unavailability? It's not rejection, it's revelation. The revelation that not everyone should have access to you, that not every message deserves a reply, that not every argument deserves your energy, that you are not a reaction, you are a revolution. And this quiet, steady, sacred return to yourself is the beginning of a life where you no longer ask permission to exist. You simply do, in wholeness, in clarity, in peace. Not because the world gave it to you, but because you finally remembered. You were it all along. Now tell me, are you ready to be misunderstood, misjudged, even hated, in the name of your inner freedom? If the answer is yes, then welcome home. Because this isn't the end. It's the beginning of the version of you they'll never forget. The one who became unavailable, not to the world, but to anything that no longer felt like truth.